For most of a century, the story was settled. The Neanderthals were the brutish runner-up, the cruder cousin who lost the long race for the planet and vanished into the ice, leaving us alone to inherit the Earth. That was the picture printed in textbooks, repeated in museums, taught to generations as fact. Then the bones were read more carefully, and far later, the genome itself was finally read. And almost every part of that story came apart in the hands of the people who had told it. They were not who we were told they were. The extinction everyone pictured did not happen the way the textbooks said, and what replaced it is stranger than disappearance, because it had been sitting inside us the entire time. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to meet the creature the textbooks got so badly wrong. Before we talk about how they died, we have to be honest about what they were, because the truth is almost the opposite of the myth. The Neanderthals were not fragile. They were built like tanks. The average adult male weighed somewhere around 183 pounds, roughly 20% heavier than the Cro-Magnon men who would later share his world. That weight was not softness, it was bone and muscle. Their skeletons were far denser than ours, in some places nearly twice as thick, the frame of a creature engineered for force. And that frame absorbed punishment that would have ended most of us. When researchers surveyed the skeletal record, they found that close to 79% of Neanderthal specimens carried the marks of past trauma that had fully healed. Broken bones, fractured skulls, in some cases, a limb lost entirely. It took a great deal to put a Neanderthal down, and a great deal more to keep him there. But strength was only half of the design. Powerful muscles and enormous lungs made them explosive over short distances, sprinters who could close on a target in seconds. What they could not do was run for hours. The genetics of their muscle fiber point toward bursts of power rather than endurance, and so they hunted accordingly. Where early humans would chase prey across open country until it collapsed from exhaustion, the Neanderthals waited, rushed, and took their quarry head-on. They were ambush hunters, and the body was the weapon. To understand how they came to be built this way, you have to follow them back hundreds of thousands of years, to the cold edge of the Ice Age. Their ancestors were a people called Homo heidelbergensis, spreading out of Africa and into a freezing Eurasia. Generation after generation, their skulls record a slow drift the researchers call Neanderthalization, each cohort adapting a little more to the cold. Long stretches of isolation, imposed by harsh weather and broken country, amplified those traits until an isolated lineage had become something genuinely distinct. Homo neanderthalensis, a separate human shaped by the ice. And every part of that body told you what it was for. The broad chest housed those larger lungs. The wide nasal cavities worked as built-in humidifiers, warming and moistening freezing air before it reached the chest. The hair, the skin, even the nails were likely thicker than ours. The brow was heavy, the teeth large and powerful. This was not a crude first draft of a human being. This was a precise answer to a specific and brutal question: how to survive a frozen world for 250,000 years. By every measure of the body, they had solved it. They were stronger than us, hardier than us, better insulated, better armored, more durable, in almost every way that the Ice Age could measure. For 250,000 years, that answer held. They were not the weak branch of the family waiting to be replaced. They were the specialists, and on their own ground, they were formidable. Which raises the harder question, the one that has unsettled the field for over a century. If the body was this good, was the mind inside it really as crude as we were once told? For most of a century, the answer was no. The mind, we were told, was the weak point. In the 19th century, the biologist Ernst Haeckel went so far as to file them under a name that says everything about the era that coined it. Homo stupidus, the stupid man. And the image that hardened around that name, the stooped, shuffling brute, came from almost nothing at all. It came from a single skeleton, studied at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France in 1911 by the anthropologist Marcelin Boulot. The individual was elderly, his spine likely deformed by arthritis, and his bent posture was generalized into the posture of an entire species. It is worth being fair to Boulot. He read the evidence he had, but the evidence he had was one old, sick man, mistaken for everyone. Strip the myth away, and the picture inverts. They stood about the same height as the Cro-Magnons beside them, and the mind kept producing things a stupid creature could not. They were working complex stone tools, axes and spears, thousands of years before our ancestors ever reached Europe. They built hearths and controlled fire. In French caves, researchers found signs that they smoked and cured meat to store it for the lean months. On cave walls, some 35,000 years ago, they cut deliberate engravings, and the scientists who examined them concluded the work required real neuromotor and volitional control, focused attention carved into stone. Then it gets stranger. They collected marine fossils. In 2024, Spanish archaeologists uncovered a cache of shells in a Neanderthal living space, objects with no practical use at all, perhaps a game, perhaps currency, perhaps simply kept because someone thought them beautiful. They decorated their tools with feathers and bone for style or for meaning rather than function. This is abstract thought, the very thing we insisted they did not possess. And they cared for their own. A specimen known as Shanidar I, found in Kurdistan in 1957, had lost the use of his right arm and suffered severe head trauma, likely leaving him blind in one eye and deaf. Analysis in 2017 showed those injuries had completely healed and that he lived into his 40s, old age in that world. No one survives that broken, that long, alone. A community fed him, sheltered him, carried him. They buried their dead with flowers and engraved points, the archaeology of grief. Here the record demands honesty. Whether they had language as we know it remains genuinely open. Their hyoid bone, essential to speech, is almost identical to ours, but vocal cords do not fossilize, and so the question cannot yet be closed. They were not even alone in their intelligence. In the icy caves of Siberia, they met another human cousin, the Denisovans, and the two lived alongside one another, worked alongside one another, and interbred. So, here is the creature the myth erased. Strong, resourceful, artistic, social, capable of grief, and carrying a mind that looks unsettlingly like our own, which deepens the mystery rather than solving it. If they were this much like us, then why are they gone? And why are we still here? For 100 years, the answers came one at a time, and every one of them fell short. The first answers were the simplest, and the first of them was wrong from the start. When the species was newly described in the early 20th century, evolution was imagined as a straight line, a single ladder climbing upward. Apes became Neanderthals, and Neanderthals became us. Each form a rung beneath the next, each one outgrown and discarded. It was a tidy picture, and it was false. As genetics matured, the ladder collapsed into something branching and messy. Neanderthals and modern humans were not parent and child. They were two distinct species grown from one common ancestor, two cousins who had taken different roads out of the same origin. And the archaeology proved something the latter could never allow. They had not merely succeeded one another, they had overlapped. For a stretch of time, the estimates placed somewhere between roughly 2,600 and 7,000 years. The two kinds of human walked the same continent at the same moment. Cro-Magnon bones and tools begin to appear in the record precisely as the Neanderthal presence starts to thin. Two species in the same country, one rising as the other faded. To many, the sequence suggested its own grim conclusion. That conclusion was the first real theory. We killed them. It is an easy story to believe, given how battered the Neanderthal skeletons are, and given what our own species has done to itself ever since. But the bones refuse to confirm it. A shattered skeleton can tell you that violence happened. It cannot tell you whose hand delivered the blow, or whether the wound came from a Cro-Magnon spear or a hunting accident or a fall on the ice. There is no proof they were slaughtered, and no proof they were not. The paleoanthropologist Paul Pettit of Durham University put the matter carefully. Contact between the two species certainly occurred, and at times it may well have turned violent. But it was exceptional, occasional, nowhere near frequent enough to wipe a species from the earth. Murder, even if it happened, was not the engine of extinction. So the search moved to a quieter killer, one that needs no weapons at all. Disease. When modern humans pushed north out of Africa, they did not arrive empty-handed. They carried with them a whole invisible cargo of germs, pathogens their own bodies had learned to survive across generations, and which the Neanderthal immune system had never once encountered. Two species sharing the same caves, the same hunting grounds, the same narrow world, would have shared their illnesses too. And a sickness that merely inconvenienced an incoming human could move through an unprepared population like fire through dry grass. The competition sharpened the danger. They hunted the same animals, drank from the same rivers, sheltered in the same valleys. In the brutal scarcity of an Ice Age winter, two species reaching for the same dwindling resources is a recipe for slow disaster, even without a single act of war. Each of these theories is plausible, each captures something real, and each, taken alone, falls short of explaining a disappearance this complete. Violence and plague can wound a population, but they need a population already weakened to finish it. And when researchers turned from how the Neanderthals died to how they had lived, they found the first real crack in the foundation. The crack was in the diet. When researchers measured the chemistry locked inside Neanderthal teeth, the levels of zinc told a clear and narrow story. These were not balanced eaters. They were carnivores, drawing the overwhelming share of their nutrition from meat. The Cro-Magnons beside them ate more widely, an omnivore's table rich in plants, vitamins, and carbohydrates, and that broader diet kept them healthier and fueled stronger development. The Neanderthal, locked into flesh, slowly fell behind on the most basic measure of all, what the body is given to run on. And a diet that narrow is a diet that is fragile. The research suggests that somewhere between 80 and 90% of their protein came from animals they hunted down themselves. That is an extraordinary dependence on a single source. As long as the herds were thick and the hunting was good, it worked. But it left no margin. Let the prey populations fall for any reason at all, and there was no second table to turn to, no stored grain, no fallback. Whole communities could simply starve. And starvation leaves marks the record has not forgotten. At some Neanderthal sites, anthropologists found something difficult to look at directly. The same butchery the Neanderthals performed on their prey, the cut marks, the broken bones, appeared on Neanderthal remains themselves. It offers real support for the possibility of cannibalism among them. But it is important to read that evidence for exactly what it is, and no more. The bones can record that an act took place. They cannot tell us the desperation that drove it. What they most likely show is not the nature of a people, but the final extremity of a people with nothing left to eat. Hunger, not cruelty, is the simplest reading of those marks. Then the climate itself closed in. We call the Pleistocene the Ice Age for a reason. It was cold, and it did not hold steady. The world cycled between glacial swings, the weather lurching from cold to far colder and back again. And the period when the Neanderthals began to fail lines up with a specific event, a millennial-long cold snap the researchers called the Heinrich H5. It was severe enough to be implicated in the loss of other great cold-adapted animals, the cave bear, the cave hyena, the megafauna that had ruled that frozen world alongside them. Creatures built for the cold are caught in a trap of their own design. To hold their body heat, they must burn enormous calories, which means they must eat constantly. So any disruption to the food supply does not merely inconvenience them. It strikes at the one thing keeping them alive. For a carnivore who drew nearly all his protein from the hunt, a deep and lasting cold that thinned the herds was not one problem among many. It was the problem, feeding every other weakness at once. Less prey meant more hunger, and more hunger meant more desperation, and a population already stretched thin had even less left to give. And yet this still is not enough. Other species endured cold just as brutal and survived it. Climate and hunger pushed hard against the Neanderthals, but pressure alone does not explain an ending this absolute. For that, you have to look at something stranger, something that came down, in part, to the shape of a thumb. The thumb sounds like a strange place to hang the fate of a species, but stay with it, because it opens onto everything. Neanderthal hands were, for the most part, our hands. The same architecture, the same grip, with two quiet differences. Their fingers were stubbier, and their thumbs met the hand at a different angle. For the work of survival, hunting, cooking, napping a blade, it changed almost nothing. But for the finest work of all, it likely mattered a great deal. Fine motor control, the kind sewing demands, was probably beyond them, and the record backs this up by what it does not contain. At Neanderthal sites, no one has ever found an awl or a sewing needle. They could tan a hide and drape it, a loose cloak, a simple poncho. What they could not do was stitch a fitted garment that sealed out the cold. The Cro-Magnons could, drawing sinew through punched holes to make clothing that held warmth against the worst the ice could throw at them. A small thing, a thumb, but it sat at the center of a much larger trap. Because the same body that made the Neanderthal a perfect ambush predator also made him a prisoner of his own territory. They were somewhat nomadic, yes, cycling through a handful of caves within a familiar range. But they rarely strayed beyond it. The stocky, short-limbed frame that closed on prey in seconds was not built for the long march, and so they stayed close to the ground they knew. Across the long glacial winters that kept their populations sealed off from one another, small and isolated and turned inward. And it is exactly there, in that isolation, that their DNA records the cost, the unmistakable signature of heavy inbreeding, a gene pool drawing again and again on the same shallow well. Now set the Cro-Magnon beside him, because the contrast is the whole story. They had evolved for the opposite world, the open African grassland. A warm climate body, longer in the limb, lighter in the bone, leaner and more efficient with its energy. It could outrun a predator, and just as importantly, it could keep going. Cro-Magnons could pick a direction and simply walk, and that single ability carried them everywhere, out of Africa and across Eurasia, over the frozen land bridge into the Americas, onto rafts and out across open water, as far as Australia, where their descendants remain 40,000 years later. And those dexterous hands built the toolkit to match the range, fitted clothing, woven baskets, ranged weapons, gear for any environment the wanderer might walk into. This is the heart of it, and it is the cruelest turn in the whole story. The Neanderthals did not die because they had failed. By every measure of their own world, they had won. They had solved the Ice Age so completely that they had no need to solve anything else. But a solution that perfect is a kind of cage. Every adaptation that made them masters of one frozen world was a chain binding them to it. And when that world began to change, the very things that had made them strong were the things that would not let them leave. Every theory so far describes a people being erased. Then, in 2010, the genome was finally read, and it told a very different story about what erased really meant. The turning point came in a laboratory, not a cave. In 2010, a team led by the geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute accomplished something the field had long thought impossible. They sequenced the Neanderthal genome, pulled a readable record of an entire species from bones tens of thousands of years old. And the first thing the genome revealed was how small the distance between us had always been. We were closer to the Neanderthals than we are to the chimpanzee, closer than that familiar figure of 98.7% shared DNA. Not a distant brute on a lower rung. A near relation. Then came the finding that turned the entire story over. The two species were close enough to have children together, viable children, and they did so not once or twice, but often enough to leave a permanent mark. Most people alive today carry up to 2% Neanderthal ancestry, written into the body and passed down across 1,000 generations. They are not entirely gone. They are in us. And that 2% is not idle. Consider what it does. The genes called OAS1, 2, and 3, inherited from them, help the modern immune system fight off viral infection. Other holdovers, ASB1 and XO6, are tied to being a night owl, a trait more common in people of European descent and a genuine asset through the long, dark winters of an ice age. But the inheritance is honest, which means it is not all gift. The same ancient DNA carries a raised risk of deep vein thrombosis, of clinical depression, of seasonal allergies. Not a clean inheritance, in other words. A human one. And this reframes the ending entirely. By the time the Cro-Magnons reached Eurasia, the Neanderthals were already failing, collapsing into small, inbred, isolated pockets, a gene pool drawing on the same shallow well until it ran thin. Into that emergency, contact brought the one thing those pockets most desperately lacked: fresh blood. New genes. So the picture inverts. What we have called an extinction may have been, in part, something quieter and stranger, a dwindling people absorbed into the larger population that surrounded them, their bloodline folded into ours rather than ended. But honesty demands the limit be stated plainly. Absorption did not save them as a species. The strong, distinct, ice-built people called Homo neanderthalensis still came to an end. Over-specialization still trapped them. The cold still thinned their herds. The isolation still hollowed out their numbers. A few % of their DNA surviving inside a Cro-Magnon body is not the survival of the Neanderthal world, and it would be sentimental to pretend otherwise. The species died. That much is real. What the DNA changes is the meaning of that death. Because there is a difference, and it is the same difference that runs through every story we get wrong about the past. Extinction sounds like erasure, like a candle pinched out, like a people who walked into the cold and simply ceased. The genome says otherwise. It says they did not vanish without a trace. The trace is the trace they left in us. Which means the question was never really why the Neanderthals disappeared. For most of a century, the story was settled. The brutish runner-up, the cruder cousin who lost the race and vanished into the ice. Then the bones were read, and the genome after them, and the story came apart, one piece at a time. Not the weak branch of the family, but a people strong, intelligent, capable of art and care and grief. Not undone by failure, but by being too perfectly made for a single world that did not last. And not vanished at all, not entirely. They were carried forward in the immune systems, the sleep, the very cells of the people now hearing this. Up to 2% of you is them. We handed them an ending. They never fully needed one. The question was never why the Neanderthals disappeared. The question is why it took us so long to notice they never entirely did.